There is a growing movement in America to bring power back to the people and call for a convention of states. Article 5 of the Constitution allows for states to have the power to propose amendments to rein in the federal government, and now millions of Americans have joined this grassroots project. Joining us this morning to discuss the impact and progress of this movement is Senior Advisor of the Convention of States Project and former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum. Good morning to you, sir. Welcome here to the National Desk.
Thank you. Good morning.
First, tell us why this is so important and how you got involved with this.
I got involved just a few years ago, really out of frustration. I spent 16 years in Congress, ran for president a couple of times, and it just seemed increasingly clear to me that Washington was growing bigger and bigger and more out of control, spending-wise. These huge deficits, which are just tragic. And resulted in inflation, crippling our country in the future. And I just didn't see anybody in Washington, either party, really doing anything about it. They're just on a sort of autopilot, just keep getting bigger and bigger and doing more and more things. And there's a provision in the Constitution, which candidly, I didn't really know much about. I mean, I knew that Congress could amend the Constitution. They could propose amendments. But I really wasn't even aware that the states had the power to do this. And to me, this is the only check that Washington will respond to, is that the states have to get together and say, look, the big problem in this country is an out of control Washington. We're a divided country in large part because we were supposed to have a federal system where states were allowed to be different, and not everybody could be ruled by one set of ideas. We allowed for a lot of variety and freedoms in this country, and that's just being lost. And this is the way back.
And it's impressive also to see just how many states have already passed a Convention of States Article 5 resolution. I'm reading here North Carolina, the latest state that could pass it to become the 20th state. Right. So how does it work? How many states do you need for this to happen?
So the Constitution says you need 2/3 of the states that pass a resolution to call for the convention, just like you need 2/3 of the Congress to vote on a resolution, vote on an amendment to send it to the states for ratification. Same thing here. You need 2/3 of the state legislatures. Governors are not involved. It's just the state legislatures. So the 2/3 of the state legislatures, we have 19 states right now where we're hopeful that, and maybe as soon as this week, that North Carolina will be the 20th state. The House in North Carolina has already passed it. We're waiting for the Senate to pass it. That would give us 20. We have a couple other states that are very close. And then, it's really a matter of continuing to build momentum here. And I think if you look at the situation in Washington and you look at the division and the dysfunction there, it really is time for us to have a discussion about what Washington should do and what Washington shouldn't. And that's all this is. There'll be a national convention with every state coming together. The state legislatures, they'll be appointing these delegates, and they'll have a discussion about federalism and the role of the states versus the federal government, and trying to, create a little bit more, a unity in this country without having Washington dictate everything from there.
Yeah, and I read that you had 28 states that look like they could be favorable at this point. For those who are not, what are the reasons why we should have federal government overreach? I mean, as a republic, why shouldn't power be given back to the people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, if you ask that question, we've done lots and lots of surveys. The public is overwhelmingly in favor of this. They realize that having policies dictated out of Washington for New York City and for rural Montana makes really very little sense. I mean, they're just, we are a huge country, we're a diverse country, and we need to allow the flexibility for people to live and to go to places and live a life that's consistent with our Constitution, but it may not be consistent with the values in San Francisco or New York or, like I said, in rural areas of this country or rural states. So this is the kind of discussion that we haven't had. And I think it's really important as Washington continues to people say, well, there's so much money in politics. Well, the reason there's so much money in politics is because in Washington is because there's so much power in Washington. If Washington didn't have a lot of power, there wouldn't be a lot of money going to these races and trying to influence people. We need to get this power out of Washington, allow the states more flexibility to live lives consistent with the values of the people in those states.
Yeah, and to be clear, your goal in this is to protect liberty, protect freedoms and privacy, and not take it away. So what's the end game here? How would this specifically limit the power and scope of the federal government to ensure that?
Yeah, so the resolution calls for three things that can be discussed at the convention. Number one, it's an Article 5 convention. Number one is to limit the jurisdiction of the federal government. For example, the federal government gets involved in education. Under the Constitution, they have no power to do so. And in fact, the only reason they get involved is they say to states, they can't tell a state, well, you have to teach, DEI or woke ideas. What they can say is, if you don't, we won't give you any money. Well, that's just really an end run around the Constitution. So the question is, can we just say, look, let the states deal with education. Let it be more at the local level where parents have more input and people, can teach the values that are consistent with the folks in those states. So that's number one. Number two is fiscal limitations on the federal government. Certainly they are absolutely needed as our deficits climb to tens of trillions of dollars. And number three is limits on terms of federal office holders. That is not just members of Congress that might have term limits, but also people within the bureaucracy. One of the big problems that a lot of folks are concerned about is that we have folks who plant themselves in the federal bureaucracy and sort of run the country from there without anybody knowing who they are. And limiting their ability to do that, I think, is another important thing we can try.
Former Senator Rick Santorum, we appreciate you joining us here this morning on the National
Thank you
Press.
for the time. Appreciate it.
Great to see you. Thank you.